And for whatever you may want to think of it in terms of its cost in human lives, it succeeded in establishing a relatively thriving rice economy. And there is certainly a sensation that exists in the thinking of the Vietnamese leaders and is documented in various of their writings that argues that, look, after all, Vietnam bore the brunt of the war. More Vietnamese died than anybody else fighting the French and the Americans. Vietnam always provided the backing for the other liberation movements. And now we've won our peace, and the Cambodians won't share with us the land and the rice that we so badly need. And kind of based on this, a scenario could be spun that could justify moving militarily into domination of the neighboring Indo-Chinese countries. I think, however, that this can't be seen apart from a Soviet conception of this situation. I think the Soviet Union recognizes very much that in looking at Southeast Asia, they're looking at a power vacuum being created. This very heavy military and political commitment that the United States had once made to this part of the world is rapidly being eroded. And the Soviet Union recognizes in this situation a chance to move in where the Americans have moved out. It's very strategic to Soviet interests, not only because Indochina looks out on the waterways that link the Persian Gulf with Japan, but Indochina also borders China, and as everyone knows, the Soviet Union and China certainly have their share of hostilities, and the Russians have 750,000 troops on the Chinese northern border, and now there is, by creating a stable Soviet-influenced Indochina, there's a possibility of also creating a threat on China's southern border, and in this way encircling the Soviet Union's Chinese rival. I think that there is a tremendous amount of complicity here between the Soviet leadership and the Vietnamese leadership in carrying out the invasion of Cambodia. In fact, there's hundreds of Soviet military advisors now in the field in Cambodia with the Vietnamese troops. The Vietnamese are using the advanced T-54 tanks that the Soviet Union has provided them with for this purpose. The aerial reconnaissance that's being flown, in some cases even being flown by Soviet pilots, although in most cases being flown by Vietnamese pilots. And during the early days of the invasion, the key to forcing the Pol Pot government to withdraw very rapidly from the major urban concentrations was saturation bombing by MiG bombers that were, in many cases, flown by Soviet pilots. So the Soviet Union has had a very direct role in all of this, as well as an indirect one. And recently, Soviet soldiers have actually been killed on the battlefield inside Cambodia, I should add. I think it is very much in the Soviet conception of the world, much as it was in the American conception of the world earlier, that the way to achieve a Pax Sovietica, or a system of global Soviet influence and control, is to create regional pockets, and in each one have a proxy force that runs the show in that area. And in Southeast Asia, certainly, the conception that the Soviet Union would have is that Vietnam can play that role. Perhaps Cuba can play that role in Latin America or in parts of Africa, and so on. This is a way of keeping naked Soviet aggression and interference from having to take place, and developing a system of doing it through proxy forces, much as Nixon tried to turn the war in Indochina earlier into more of an Asian war by getting Korean and Thai troops to do much of the fighting in Vietnam. We need to look at some of the other forces involved in this conflict. We need to look at China's role. China is very concerned about this situation. They're concerned about a Vietnamese-dominated Indochina. In February of 1979, the Chinese invaded Vietnam, crossed the border, and fought for 3 weeks in northern Vietnam in a very destructive war that took place there, which the Chinese argued was punishment for Vietnam's continued incursions across the Chinese border, and in principle also, obviously, punishment for Vietnam's invasion and occupation of Cambodia. The Chinese seem to be saying, we will not tolerate a Soviet-Vietnamese sphere of influence on our southern border, and if you continue in this on this road, we're going to be forced to resort to a military response. So this conflict definitely exists. I think the Chinese would rather not carry out another military strike into Vietnam. However, their options in keeping themselves from having to do that are fairly limited. The main option they're employing right now is to continue fairly heavy backing for the Khmer Rouge as well as the other guerrillas that are willing to fight the Vietnamese inside Cambodia, with the view being that by tying the Vietnamese down in Cambodia, they'll be ultimately weakening them and creating a situation of attrition where ultimately the better part of valor on the Vietnamese part will have to be to withdraw from the conflict. At the same time, China is very much encouraging forces internationally to draw the line at Cambodia in Indochina and to draw the line at Afghanistan in the Middle East. And the Chinese argue at every international forum and at every meeting with foreign leaders that there is a problem here of global Soviet expansion, that if you let Soviet Union or Soviet proxy forces move into different parts of the world unchecked, eventually the balance of power will shift inalterably in the Soviet direction. And when that happens, the logical conclusion of that argument would be that we'll see another world war. So the Chinese argue very forcefully that if you don't stop the Russians and the Vietnamese from expanding in this way, you're going to pay the price later on. And they argue with all the power they have that everyone should join in a concerted campaign to support the Cambodian resistance and to tie the Vietnamese down in Cambodia. Thailand is a very important factor in all this. In June, Vietnamese forces pushed into Thailand. They pushed through the Cambodian frontier and on into Thailand. And there were several days of fighting that took place in the border areas. Vietnam, in its press reports, again, sounds a little like the old days of Nixon. Vietnamese talk about how there's Cambodian guerrilla sanctuaries inside Thailand, and this is why the Vietnamese have to cross the border and fight in Thailand. Of course, this was the argument that Nixon used as to why the Americans had to invade Cambodia in 1970, was because there were supposedly Vietnamese guerrilla sanctuaries inside Cambodia. Thailand is very worried. The main issue in Thai politics, and from my time I spent in Thailand, I can tell you that Thai politics are very complicated, but the main issue is how to respond to what has now become their Vietnamese neighbor, now that Vietnam has pushed across the Cambodian territory. And I would say most political factions in Thailand are united on an approach of doing what they can to help the Kampuchean resistance in the hopes that this will maintain a buffer between Thailand and Vietnam. And that means extending fairly heavy aid to the refugees in the camps, and also means at least turning a blind eye to military supplies and products passing through Thai territory to the resistance. I would say this is, generally speaking, the thinking of all the ASEAN countries, although each Southeast Asian country has a different bent on it, and some lean a little more to the Vietnamese, but all have collectively taken positions at every one of their foreign ministers' meetings and their summit meetings, and collectively at the UN, insisting that the Vietnamese withdraw entirely from Cambodia. And finally, I should say something about the American role in all this. There is an American role. The United States certainly is extending some military aid to Thailand, not anywhere near enough to satisfy the Thais, but a very significant amount, in fact, by any objective standard. The United States has taken the position at the United Nations that it will continue to support the seating of the Pol Pot Democratic Kampuchea government, although it does not recognize that government. It has taken the position that to de-recognize it, or to allow the seat to remain vacant, would be to encourage the Vietnamese aggressive activity. And most of the world opinion reflected at the United Nations has concurred with that opinion in all the votes that have been taken. And the United States has not disavowed that position, although there's been intense pressure from inside the State Department and from other circles in this country calling on the United States to support a position of no seat for Cambodia at the UN, or to recognize the Heng Samrin regime. But basically, I would say U.S. policy is characterized by confusion and a lack of coherent response to how to deal with this very troubled situation. And it's made more complicated by the fact that most Americans in politics and in the military have a pretty bad taste in their mouths left from the Vietnam conflict. All those issues and contradictions have not been sorted out. There's a tremendous fear and resistance to acting in any kind of a bold way in that part of the world again. And at the same time, no new policy to deal with the situation has been evolved. So I would say the U.S. remains very much suffering from confusion and inaction on the situation. And I would venture to say that it's going to become an increasing question of U.S. foreign policy because the situation there is only going to get hotter and hotter, and it's going to force Americans and American leaders to make some decision about how they're going to play their cards there. I'd like to say, just by way of wrapping up this talk, and then I want to show you some of the film and give you a little more of a feel for what it's like to be inside Cambodia, that I think there's several possible scenarios for what could happen. And I'll outline them to you, and you can give them some thought. I think one possibility is that the Vietnamese could, as they continue to suffer casualties, as their war grows unpopular at home, and as Vietnamese people start to wonder why their sons and daughters are being sent off to fight in Cambodia, and as other of the contradictions internal to the Vietnamese society heat up, as the Soviet Union becomes unable to come through on all the aid it's promised to Vietnam because it's also being forced to make such substantial aid commitments to Afghanistan and elsewhere. As all these factors heat up, there could be some sentiment on the part of at least a section of the Vietnamese leadership to try to extricate itself from the situation and to try to negotiate some kind of peace in Cambodia and accept some coalition government of the various Cambodian forces and to allow a neutral Cambodia to exist. I think that would be very positive if that happened. I think that's not very likely to happen. I think it's clear that when the Vietnamese committed themselves to this road, at least the leaders knew exactly what they were doing, exactly what the casualties would be, exactly what the cost would be to carry out such a campaign, and for whatever their reasons, they believed it was necessary and should be continued. And certainly the Soviet Union, which doesn't have to suffer hardly any casualties to carry out this conflict, certainly sees it that way. In that sense, I would see the great danger of a different kind of scenario, of the one Prince Sihanouk outlined to me, I think holding a much greater possibility, of the Vietnamese military machine over a period of time really gaining the upper hand in the region and being able to extend its influence throughout most of Southeast Asia. Whether or not that happens depends a lot on whether or not the Cambodian resistance forces get themselves together. If they can unite and form a stronger opposition front than they've yet been able to do, that may not be what happens. If public opinion internationally takes a stronger stand than it has yet to oppose these kinds of invasions and aggressions, that may be another kind of check on balance that keeps that kind of expansionism from taking place. But those factors are very much up in the air. That very much remains to be seen. So I think any one of those scenarios are possible, and I think in the present situation, what is most likely is that we'll see, at least for the next 6 months or so, a pretty much status quo. The guerrilla resistance will continue. The Vietnamese will continue to throw more and more into the war effort. Hunger, misery, disease, starvation will continue on all sides. And I think it's going to take a significant changing of the constellation of forces on one side or the other, or a significant change of mind or heart on one side or the other, for the situation to be actually materially altered one way or the other. So I would like to stop there. I'm going to run the videotape. Let me say a few words about it before it's shown. First of all, I apologize for the quality of it. Videotape doesn't seem to do very well when it gets blown up to a screen proportion. A lot of articles, not only from the U.S. press, but from European press, Well, I think that the people I've talked to who've been in Cambodia on the Vietnamese-controlled side report that that there is some stabilization of the situation. There are more people living in Phnom Penh now than there were before. There's been some repopulation of some of the other urban centers, but that as to putting together an economy or something like that, that really the situation has not hardly changed at all. That there's no school system functioning even to the level that there was one before. That the freedom of religion that was supposed to be promised by the coming about of the Vietnamese invasion has not really taken place. The Buddhists are playing no role in the government or in the social structure. And I've talked to quite a few people who are not necessarily antagonistic to the Vietnamese, who've been with them, who've seen the situation fairly, close to the ground, not only in Phnom Penh but in other areas, and report that the situation overall is fairly static, and that except for the people who've been brought into the administrative apparatus to the extent that one exists at the local level, everyone else is more or less left on their own. If they can farm, fine, then they can eat. If they can't farm, there's no way of getting seed rice or way of getting equipment or anything like that. And I think the main indicator of that is the continued outflow of the refugees. So I wouldn't say that nothing positive has happened or that no changes have taken place. I think certainly there has been, and the Vietnamese have brought a great deal of technical expertise, and they now have working with them advisors from a number of other countries and so on, and I'm sure that something is being done. But the picture I get is not quite as positive as the one you would suggest, and in fact people are talking about in many places, especially outside of Phnom Penh, the situation having remained unchanged or worsened in terms of food rations. Yeah. Well, Vietnam was reunified in 1976. The northern and southern half were brought together. It's a very interesting question. I recently talked with a fellow by the name of Trong Nhu Thang, and he's a South Vietnamese figure who was a very high-ranking person in the South Vietnamese revolutionary situation. He was the Minister of Justice in the Provisional Revolutionary Government, which was the government that was the shadow government that was fighting the Americans in South Vietnam during the war. He was one of the founders of the National Liberation Front in South Vietnam in 1960. And he last year escaped from Vietnam. He became a boat person and escaped to a refugee camp in Indonesia, subsequently came to France. And I spoke with him this summer in France, and I spent quite a bit of time listening to his story and listening to what he had to say about what happened in South Vietnam. And he felt very strongly that South Vietnam had been forcibly reunified with the North, that at the time the war came to an end, he felt there was a popular sentiment to want to reunify with the North, to have one country, but that they had been promised that it was going to be a 10-year process of slow bringing together the two halves and of slow changing of the ways on both accounts, and instead it was suddenly, and without much expectation, called as a question in 1976. There was no real opportunity to debate or discuss it, and it was simply accomplished. He felt that the product of that was the northern leadership pretty much dominating the political structure almost entirely. He said that of the 24 members of the Provisional Revolutionary Government who signed the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, I believe, on behalf of South Vietnamese revolutionary forces, 18 of them today are fundamentally opposed to the course that the government is taking. And 6 have been given some kind of token position, or in 1 or 2 cases, a significant position in the new reunified structure. So at least from this one source, he painted a pretty comprehensive picture of North Vietnamese domination of the South, and said, and not so much blanket North Vietnamese domination of the South, but that he really pinned it to the political power grouping that's in power right now as having been part of a concerted strategy to develop the situation. I've also talked with a number of South Vietnamese soldiers who've sought refugee status in Thailand. They've defected from their units inside Cambodia and sought refugee status in Thailand. And many of them talk about, in fact, one guy I talked to in particular, he said to me, it's just like the American black soldiers had it during the American War. The South Vietnamese are treated in the Vietnamese army the way the blacks were treated in the American army when you all were fighting over here. And he made that comparison. And he said that basically the South Vietnamese soldiers in the army are the ones who are put on the front lines and are given the most dangerous combat duty, and it's mainly, the officer corps is mainly from the north and so on. So that's one side of the story. The other side is they have reunified the country. There's a lot of, I would sense that there's a lot of opposition, but there's no organized existing opposition calling to change that or dismantle that or reform it in any way. And I would imagine that for many people in Vietnam, the question is not so much unity with the North or not, as it is what kind of life are they going to have in the future. And if they're going to get a better life by being united with the Northerners, that's fine with them, but they don't see the results yet. Yeah. I would say that the question, I don't know if people heard it, was whether I favored Western military aid to the Khmer Rouge or other forces in the area. I don't think they need that, and I would be very hesitant to call for the United States playing that kind of direct and active role. I think it's better for the U.S. to have, I would like to see the U.S. take a stronger political stance of opposing Vietnamese control of the area. But I don't think that has to be backed up necessarily by supplying guns. As far as I understand, the Khmer Rouge are able to get the weapons that they need from China and on the black market in Thailand and from capturing the enemy's weapons. What they really need and aren't getting is food and medicine and so on. That's just trickling in, and it's very hard to get in. And I think the U.S. could play a much better role in providing food and medicine than in providing arms.
Yes, you made it sound, or at least the idea that I got was that in Vietnam, that America was the heavy there, and that Vietnam managed to liberate themselves from U.S. and French intervention there. Isn't it more that the Communist Party has set up their government in Vietnam now, and not that they were actually liberated from anybody?
Well, I think, first of all, I think the whole Vietnam experience is a very complicated one that will take years of hindsight before Americans as a whole really get a good handle on understanding what happened there and what happened to us in the course of that experience. But I think the Vietnamese people as a whole very much wanted to be masters of their own country and wanted to get French interests and American interests out of there. But I think they were betrayed in doing that, and I think they were betrayed by the leaders of those communist parties that ended up just reinstitutionalizing the same kind of dictatorship and selling their country out to Soviet interests instead of American interests. And I think that's the real tragedy of the situation, that there were, among the majority of people, there was a desire to even lay down their lives to fight for freedom, and then no freedom was forthcoming. Well, I don't see much possibility of the Khmer Rouge coming back to power. I think any change in the situation is going to require a pretty, they won't be able to do it on their own. They're going to have to hook up with a lot of the other forces, and there's going to have to be a lot of give and take politically over what, should they be victorious, what kind of political structure to implement. So that's a possibility, but I think it's also offset by the fact that to be victorious, they would need a broader national scope to their political program. Yeah. I think it depends very heavily on where in Cambodia you talk to someone. Unfortunately, there aren't very many Cambodians on the street. The life is not a normal life of a country, and people have been forced to choose sides and forced to take stands. In the areas that the film is from, those people, there's no doubt they support the Khmer Rouge completely, and they sense that there's not going to be a salvation of their country and their people until the Vietnamese are kicked out. But that's a minority of people. Those are the ones who've chosen to make the commitment to live in that kind of situation and to fight. Inside the Vietnamese-controlled areas, people who have remained there and haven't fled, I would think, have a lot of sympathy for the Vietnamese and feel that no matter how bad the situation is, at least it's better than Pol Pot. But I would think that, too, is not a majority of the population. That's also a minority. And in between, in the countryside, in the disputed areas, I think there's a tremendous sensation of, I would say the average Cambodian would like to see the Vietnamese out of the country and would like to see a Cambodian in Cambodia. But as to how to achieve that and how to, what political program to implement, what side to support, I think a lot of Cambodians are pretty confused about that, too. Yeah. When was this? I'm sorry, I don't think I follow what you're saying. You're saying that the uh-huh. Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, no, I think some of that was going on. Obviously, it's very hard when you have starvation to convince people not to eat seed rice, but to plant it instead. It's a nice philosophical choice to make, but when you're starving, it's very easy. It's a lot easier to eat the seed rice. But I don't think that's the main reason crops aren't being planted. In fact, the areas I visited, the crops were being planted. And I think what's happening on the Cambodia-Thailand border is that it's a very sensitive political hotspot. And the Vietnamese are attempting to dictate terms to the international relief agencies as to how and under what conditions aid may be distributed. And they're using their control of the border stations, where they do control them, as a political lever in trying to exact concessions from the relief agencies as to how they're going to go about distributing food, because obviously the Vietnamese would like them to distribute it in a way which doesn't allow any food to get to the Pol Pot people and allows all of it to get to the Hang Son Rin side. And I think the international agencies have gone back and forth on trying to figure out what is the most effective response to this kind of situation. And so as a result, the border gets open, the border gets closed, and so on. Yep.
I got a couple questions, actually. The first one I'd like to ask is, okay, when the United States is sending grain over to Cambodia, it had to go a long way. It had to go across the ocean. It had to go through, cross borders. The Vietnamese may or may not have been holding up shipments along the trucks. How much do you know? Do you know if grain was getting there in a good percentage, like 50 or 90% of the grain received to refugee staff? And was there any spoilage among that grain?
Well, at the risk of making people cynical, which is about the last thing I would want to do, there's been a lot of problems with the aid program, as I understand it, and I spent a lot of time in Thailand talking with aid officials. And one thing that's just kind of shocking is the amount of dollars that are raised for the aid programs and the percentage of those that go to overhead and bureaucracy and shipping, and the small percentage that goes to actually purchase the foodstuffs and medical supplies that are actually being delivered to the people. But certainly, that's a very unfortunate situation. And not only that, there's a lot of scandal and corruption involved. And I think this week 6 people were indicted on a variety of charges, including taking bribes and showing favoritism for what food companies on behalf of the U.S. government they were going to buy food from for this project, which is just, I mean, you picture these starving Cambodian people and Americans out of the goodness of their hearts trying to do something to save these people, and you picture this kind of corruption getting in the middle of it, and it's just a frightening thought. But the food program so far, I would say, has been a success. The relative well-being of 700,000 to 1 million Cambodian refugees in Thailand is a direct result of the fact that people all over the world and governments around the world responded to this crisis and provided money and shipped food, and it did get there. Whether, a significant measure of it didn't get there and was used for corrupt purposes and so on, but what did get there is responsible for the salvation of at least 1 million people in the refugee camps and many more on the interior of the country. There was quite a few problems with spoilage. There was quite a few problems with sending food that was not in the local diet of the people. Corn that people didn't know how to cook, milk that people didn't drink, and these kind of things. But and I think it's necessary to take note of that, but I would not use that to draw the conclusion that therefore people shouldn't raise money or shouldn't try to support the aid programs. Go ahead.